effectively in providing lawyers for the country. So in that context, I again welcome you and hope this interactions will continue and through you our students will not only they will learn a lot skills, but at the same time they will get inspiration that okay, litigation is an excellent career where many people should go and not they should only look for some others corporate opportunity. So welcome you again, sir, and hope to see you on campus once the entire this pandemic is over.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor Khan. Thank you.
I request all the participants to keep their videos off and their mics on mute. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the chat box. Since the theme for the day is PIL and anti-defection law, the first half of the hour will be devoted to PIL and the second half will be devoted to anti-defection law. Thank you. Sir, you may please take over.
Thank you, Rupal. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Khan. Thank you, Professor Sarfaraz. Thank you for the kind words. Rupal, thanks a lot for having me here. Ahmed, thank you for this invite. A very good evening to all of you all and happy Ganesh Chaturthi. Today is a very auspicious day and I'm glad that all of you all are here to attend this webinar. A couple of things first. Please don't take it as if it's a classroom lecture. You're not going to get any credits for this. Please take it as a light conversation between somebody who's already into the profession, a place where almost all of you all in the next year, 2 years, 3 years will eventually come. We'll all be a part of the same tribe. And just don't have this tension of noting down case laws or jotting notes or whatever. Just sit back, relax. Just let's have this easy conversation. And at the end of the talk, I will myself give you the relevant areas where you can do any further study, any further research. And there are a couple of case laws. I won't be burdening you all with many of them, but whichever case laws that I'm citing, we'll have it emailed to Rupal so Rupal can disseminate it to everybody. So even that also will be done. So don't just worry about case law, citation, jotting down notes. Today is the time where we just understand the fundamentals and we have an easygoing conversation where you can just express any and every doubt you have. Don't feel hesitant, don't feel ashamed. No question is stupid. Every question has its own virtue, its own value. And we hopefully the next hour or so we'll all learn together. So there are two broad areas of today's discussion. One would be public interest litigation and the other would be the 10th schedule, the Anti-Defection Act. Both of them straddle diverse universes. The public interest litigation is a totally separate aspect and 10th schedule is in its own area. And as Professor Sarfaraz Khan really very rightly pointed out, these are the cutting edge aspects of litigation, which once you all start coming to courts or those of you all who choose to go in for litigation will realize that this is actually something that quite a few fundamentals must be very clear before you actually venture into that. Now, what is public interest litigation? So first things first. Before you understand public interest litigation, you must understand what is the opposite of it. That is, what is private litigation. Now, supposing there is a dispute between two individuals. For example, you are the landlord. You have a house which you've given it on rent to a tenant. The tenant refuses to vacate after the conclusion of the tenancy period. So you have no option but to then go to the rent control court or to go to a civil court and seek an eviction of that tenant from your property. So when that case is filed, a case between the landlord and the tenant, that case is a private litigation between two aspects. The law laid down in that case may be cited in subsequent other private cases. That's a separate issue altogether, no problem. But the essential nature of litigation is private between you and your tenant. So that is one example of private litigation. Another aspect is, for example, there is a university, say in Telangana, in Hyderabad, which has a law college, and it comes up with a regulation that all 100% seats would be reserved for the domicile of Telangana. Okay, so if or all 100% seats would be reserved for those in Hyderabad. Now, I as a citizen of this country would feel that this law led or this regulation for admission by that college, it offends Article 14 and Article 15 of the Constitution of India. It is something that you cannot have a law solely based on domicile, and that too to the extent of 100%, excluding everyone else from the rest of the country. So therefore, what I do is I file a petition, say in the Telangana High Court at Hyderabad. Now the judge would ask me that, Mr. Fernandes, are you seeking an admission in that college? I say no. Is any one of your relatives, friends, dependents, are they seeking an admission into the college? I say no. Then the judge can ask, then how are you concerned? If it is not affecting you directly, then why should you come to the court? See, unlike in that earlier example when I gave, that in the landlord-tenant dispute, it's your own house, it's your own property. So if someone does not vacate, you go to court. You have the right to go to court. And the legal terminology for right to going to court is known as locus standi. Locus, L-O-C-U-S, locus standi, S-T-A-N-D-I. That is your right to go to the court. Okay. So now in this petition that I file, the court will ask, so Mr. Fernandes, you have nothing to do with this regulation. You have nothing to do with this college. You're already an advocate. None of your relatives, friends, dependents want an admission or have applied for it. Then why should we entertain you? So therefore, what I would answer is that this petition has been filed in public interest. Now, what public interest has distinguished, or has in contrast to private interest, is that the person who files the case does not have any personal aspect, personal interest involved there. That is the critical element. See, many a times, see at this stage where you are right now, where there is, I can understand the obsession for CGPA scores and placements and whatnot. But if there's one singular tip which I can give it to you, that this is a stage where you have to get your fundamentals cleared. So when you clear your fundamentals, you should know on very exact terms, because public interest litigation is a very loosely worded term. For example, if there would be a father of a child who's applying for this college, which has reserved 100% seats to students from Hyderabad, and the father has a child in Delhi, and he files a writ petition, then that petition is not a petition in public interest. Why? Because he is interested in the outcome of that on a personal level. So when you file a petition, when you are moved out of larger interests, out of interest towards constitutionality, towards the rule of law, then in that case, those petitions are called public interest litigations, where you are not benefiting from the final outcome. So that is the litmus test to understand what is a private interest litigation and what is a public interest litigation. That is, the person who moves to the court, number one, person moving to the court should not have any benefit from the final outcome. He is doing it purely in discharge of his duties as a conscientious citizen, as an aware citizen who wants to bring a wrongdoing to the notice of the court and get it rectified. That's number one. And number two is the doctrine or the principle of locus standi gets considerably relaxed in the case of a public interest litigation. So therefore, when you file a private interest litigation, supposing you're filing for an eviction of a tenant, you have to show that you are the landlord and you are materially connected with the final outcome, or you have a right and interest in the flat. But supposing in a public interest litigation, there is no such aspect. There is no such requirement of me showing a locus standi. There is no requirement that I have to show that yes, I have something materially involved here. I'm going to be impacted, I'm going to be affected, and therefore I've come to this court. So you don't have to show that. You just have to show that there is a wrongdoing that can affect the public at large, that can affect the nation at large, which is unconstitutional, which is illegal, which is against the laws, and therefore you have come to the court and brought it to the notice of the court, and then it's up to the court as to what it does. Okay, so these are the broad contours of a public interest litigation. Now, how does this public interest litigation come about? Because see, earlier we had our courts, after the constitution came into force, we had the Supreme Court, and then we have various high courts, we have civil courts, we have criminal courts, and we have a variety of cases. So it's in the United States of America in the 1960s that this system started, where they relaxed the doctrine of locus standi. Because there were several litigations earlier in the US, you must have heard about it or read about it, what is known as racial segregation. The white people had their own separate schools, for example, and the blacks had their own separate schools. They had their own separate restaurants, their own separate public facilities, and it was prohibited for a black man to get admitted into a white man's college or into go to a white man restaurant and so on and so forth. So when there were some conscientious citizens who initiated litigation against these obviously discriminatory and violative measures, which were in direct violation to the Constitution of the United States of America, and an objection was raised by the other side that how can they file it? How are they affected? So then the US Supreme Court relaxed the doctrine of locus standi and said that sorry, if there is an issue that has been brought to us, which has overwhelming public interest, where the people at large across the country are going to be affected and impacted, then in that case we will relax the concept of doctrine of locus standi and permit such petitions to be filed. So this is how the trend started in the United States, and then in United Kingdom, and then in the 1980s, in India we had this system of public interest litigation, whereby there were certain great judges in the Supreme Court in the 1980s, especially the former Chief Justice of India, Justice P.N. Bhagwati. He is credited with really developing this jurisprudence of public interest litigation, where even on a letter or a postcard that was addressed to the Chief Justice of India, that was converted into a public interest litigation, and various orders were passed by the Supreme Court. So this is the genesis of public interest litigation. For example, there was one prisoner who was facing great deal of difficulties in the jail. There were abominable conditions in the prison, which were totally dehumanizing. So he writes a letter to the Chief Justice of India. That letter is converted into a public interest litigation, into a writ petition. That is Sunil Batra's case. Then we have Hussain Ara Khatun, another such letter that came to the Supreme Court with regards to an inordinate delay in the conduct of trial. That got converted into a public interest litigation. Then for bonded laborers, we had Bandhwa Mukti Morcha. That was another an NGO which was involved in these social causes. They wrote a letter to the Chief Justice of India then in the 80s. That got converted into a PIL. So initial jurisprudence in India that got developed was basis of letters. A simple mere postcard was enough for the Supreme Court to initiate measures. And then gradually, just as you file a substantive petition before the court, substantive public interest litigations came to be filed on various issues. And today in Supreme Court, you would find two of the major areas where there are still petitions pending in Supreme Court despite it being filed around 20-30 years ago. One would be MC Mehta's case, which was filed in 1985. And it is still pending in the Supreme Court because it pertains to environmental pollution across the country. So for any measure which you feel that there is going to be an environmental aspect involved, you have to approach the Supreme Court, file an application in this case, and then seek whatever remedies you want to seek. And with regards to forest rights, we have T.N. Godavarman's case that was filed way back in 95. And we are in 2020, 25 years down the line, and it's still pending in the Supreme Court. So what Supreme Court has done is it has expanded the area of public interest litigation into various fields over the years. Because initially, as I said, in the 1980s, it was essentially the weak, the oppressed. Now, for example, a bonded laborer somewhere in the remote part of the country. How will that bonded laborer have access to the Supreme Court? You see, so these were the cases that Supreme Court initially took and the initial stages of public interest litigation, and has more and more cases came to be filed, more and more petitions came to be filed, more and more orders and judgments came to be pronounced. The jurisprudence, the law on that subject, which is called jurisprudence, the PIL jurisprudence, that got developed gradually. And once it was developed gradually, after that we had Supreme Court entertaining petitions on diverse aspects. Like, for example, when there was no effective overseeing of the CBI, and there was a public interest litigation. Now, Mr. Prashant Bhushan, who is there in the news these days, he is one of the pioneers in the Supreme Court of having filed in his lifetime at least more than 100 public interest litigations. There are several areas under the sun which covers corruption in public areas, which covers areas where the legislature or the parliament has not made laws. So he's moved all those public interest litigations. Other public spirited people have moved public interest litigations, and Supreme Court has passed various orders. So initially the jurisprudence evolved or started from social causes. It developed into socio-economic causes, and now it has also gone further into environmental causes. You see, so there is hardly an area of your life where a public interest litigation cannot be filed or has not been filed and the Supreme Court has not passed directions. Another classic example which all of us should be aware of are the Vishaka guidelines. For example, for until recently, until a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when there was a law made by the parliament for prevention of sexual harassment in workplaces, there was absolutely no law to deal with this subject. So until 2015 or so, if there is a sexual harassment at workplace, the aggrieved party had no law under which the aggrieved party could have sought legal redress of a grievance. So this was brought to the notice of the Supreme Court in the 90s itself, and so in a public interest litigation. And Supreme Court passed various guidelines which are known as the Vishaka guidelines. Vishakha, that's the Vishaka case. The case was called Vishaka versus Union of India, state of Rajasthan. And those guidelines came to be known as Vishaka guidelines, where Supreme Court laid down several guidelines as to what should be done in the absence of a law made by the parliament. And then what the Supreme Court says, that this is only till the time that the parliament does not make the law. Once the parliament makes the law, then though that law will prevail, but till such time the law is not there, we cannot let our people, the people of this country, the citizens of this country, be in lurch. There has to be some laws. There cannot be a vacuum with regards to this aspect. And therefore, the Vishaka guidelines held field for almost 15 years. And it took 15 years then for the parliament to actually make a law, and then that law now governs the field. You see, so these are the salutary impact of public interest litigation. The various aspects with regards to pollution. You would find that there are or for example economic offences. You had the 2G scam, coal scam, etc., all these scams that you hear. Many a times the government is not interested in addressing these scams because unfortunately sometimes some of them are involved in it. They are the direct beneficiaries. So therefore you approach the Supreme Court or you approach the High Court under Article 226. So what you file is a writ petition. If you go to the High Court, that writ petition is filed under Article 226. If you go to Supreme Court, that same writ petition is filed under Article 32. But where it is your private interest involved, it's a private writ involved, then it's a simpliciter writ petition. But where it is filed in public interest, that same writ petition assumes the nature of a PIL. So PIL is not some different animal altogether. It is nothing but a writ petition. Like for example, somebody has applied in a college, just to give another example, and that person is of a higher rank, but that person is not given the admission, and a person lower than her or him is given the admission. So she goes to the court. She files what is known as a writ petition. If she goes to the High Court, she files that writ petition under Article 226. If she directly approaches the Supreme Court, that writ petition would be filed under Article 32 of the Constitution of India. Now, in that, she is materially connected with the relief, because she is saying that I have been illegally deprived. So her relief in that petition is, please strike out the admission of the person below me and please give me that seat. Okay, so she is materially interested. She has a direct benefit from the final outcome of that litigation. That is called a private interest litigation or a private writ petition, which is filed by a citizen of the country under 226 if it's the High Court and 32 if it's the Supreme Court. But to give you that earlier example where I am aggrieved by the admission process itself, though I am not applying, none of my relatives or friends or anyone known to me are applying, then in that case, that petition that I filed in the High Court under 226 assumes the nature of a public interest litigation. So it's the same petition, but instead of having private interest there, its nomenclature is public interest litigation, PIL. So you have earlier writ petition civil number so and so of 2020. If it's a PIL, it will be writ petition civil bracket PIL of so and so number of 2020. That's the difference. You see, so this is the only difference. The format, the structure and everything is broadly the same. So you file a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court issues notice, calls the other parties, calls for explanations, calls for reply, and then it passes the order. So, but this is how PIL has broadly evolved and developed over the years. It's from social causes to economic causes to environmental aspects to matters with public law, public policy, where even, for example, another major area of which has law students, you must understand, is the NJAC judgment, the National Judicial Accountability Commission judgment, where the Parliament in 2018 and 17 came up with a totally different law with regards to admission, with regards to elevation of judges in the Supreme Court and the High Court. Now that also was challenged. That was challenged by an advocates association, and it was in the nature of a public interest. And in the nature of a public interest, Supreme Court struck down a constitutional amendment. So imagine the power of the courts under PIL. They're immense power. There is no restriction on them. They can do anything under the sun. So even an amendment to the Constitution of India was challenged by in a public interest litigation, and Supreme Court in a public interest litigation strikes down the amendment to the Constitution, which all of you all would know that Constitution of India is the highest law. There is nothing above that. So even an amendment in the Constitution of India could have been set aside by virtue of a public interest litigation. So this can give you an idea as to what a potent weapon this is as of a PIL. That it is something that you can really rectify the wrongs that are happening all around you, in your society, in your country, in your politics. Everything can be done via public interest litigation. Now this is the good part of PIL. Now what is the bad part? Now what happened was there's been a trend that is discernible all throughout, that many a times PIL was being misused in order to create problems for your commercial rivals. Now for example, in Hyderabad, now all of you all in Hyderabad, you will have stayed there for some time. Assuming the state government decides that we will build an expressway, a super fast expressway from Hyderabad to Secunderabad, or from Hyderabad to Bangalore. And they float a tender, from Hyderabad to Bangalore, we'll have a super fast expressway build. They float a tender, one entity becomes a successful bidder. Now the person who has lost out, what that person will do, that person will get a so-called public spirited person to file a PIL against this very company that has won the tender. And they will present some dope against that company before the Supreme Court. That see this company which has been awarded this 100,000 crore tender, this company's director is a fraud, this company's owners have been in jail, this company has been noted for tax fraud, this company is in collusion with the government officials, this company has bribed government officials, and all such allegations and all such material will be placed. Then what the court will do, the court will get into the picture, they will issue notice, they will stay the project, they will say that no, let us see first whether is there any truth in this. And then from the High Court, you go to Supreme Court, back to the High Court. In all these 4 or 5 years takes place and the project becomes unviable because there is cost escalation. See, something that you got, those 5-year students would remember, whatever, say in your canteen or in the shops, whatever you used to buy in your first year, is it the same price what it is now that you're in the 5th year or those who are in the 4th year? So obviously there is a cost escalation every year. So same thing happens to these projects. You just have to delay it. Once you delay it, there's a tremendous cost escalation. So when you had submitted the tender thinking that X amount of rupees would be sufficient, suddenly it becomes X plus 100, you see, and then that leads to a loss of contract, loss of business opportunity, loss of economic opportunity, you see. So that is one area of misuse of public interest litigation. Another area of misuse is supposing the principal of a college is being appointed and there is another person who feels offended, or how come this fellow got appointed as the principal, or there is some important public post, say vice chancellor of the university. Someone is being appointed as vice chancellor and someone else wanted to get appointed. That fellow feels left out. So what that fellow will do, will leak some information against the person who's ultimately appointed as the vice principal to some other chap who will file a so-called public interest litigation and give all the dope against this fellow. You see, so of late, public interest litigations, say in the last, you could say around 10-15 years at least, has been manipulated to settle private scores. So PILs now have become a potent weapon now to cause damage to a private entity rather than cause any benefit. Say for example, the government of India comes up with a scheme, and that scheme, say a telecom scheme, and that telecom scheme say benefits a company A. So what company B would do, it would then set up one public interest litigation, go to Supreme Court and challenge that very policy. That policy will be challenged, saying that, oh, it is in violation of the Constitution, it is violation of Article 14. People of India will have to cough up more money for using data and for using broadband and mobile phone, and you please scrap this policy. They will not name the company which is getting the benefit out of this, or the company is getting benefit out of it, but they will try to attack that very policy. And once that policy goes, obviously the commercial benefits that would have flowed from the policy to the various companies down below, all that goes. You see, so therefore there has been a very consistent and a very prominent misuse of PIL litigation in this country for the last 15-20 years. And therefore, the Supreme Court came up with a judgment in 2013. And what I would suggest is that instead of reading 10% of 10 judgments, I would suggest you all read 100% of one judgment to master an area of a subject. And this tip of mine applies across the board in whichever jurisdiction, in whichever subject you want to study. We have this tendency to show off that, oh, I read 10 case laws. But at the stage where reading 10 case laws as if you have read a novel or a newspaper is not what's going to help you. You just don't have to read it. You have to understand it, analyze it, ingest it, imbibe it. And for that purpose, it is better you read one case law 10 times rather than read 10 case law once. See, for the examination, yes, you have to read those 10 case laws and you have to reproduce them. That's fine. But there is life, and your actual life will begin after these examinations are over and after you enter the profession. And once you enter the profession, no one is going to ask you how many case laws you have read. What they will know is, do you understand the law? Do you know the law? Are your fundas clear? And your fundas can be clear only when there is a case law which you have properly ingested, properly understood, so that you get to know the entire gamut of what that subject is. And for PILs, although from 1980s, as I said, Bandhwa Mukti Morcha, Hossein Ara Khatun, Sunil Batra, T.N. Goda Varman, M.C. Mehta, you will have a plethora of cases in your course material which deal with this. But I would suggest, there is Balwant Singh Chaufal versus State of Uttarakhand, which is Justice Dalveer Bhandari's judgment, who's currently a judge in the International Court of Justice. He's India's nominee there in that court. He's been there since the last 7-8 years now. The Kulbhushan Jadhav case that was heard by the ICJ, Justice Bhandari was one of the judges there. So he authored this judgment, Balwant Singh Chaufal versus State of Uttarakhand. It's a 2013 judgment. And that judgment will have it mailed to you. We'll have it mailed to Rupal, and whosoever is interested can please contact Rupal and take it. And just go through that judgment, especially from para 25 onwards, where there is a before para 25 are the facts pertaining to that specific case, which may not be very relevant for you all. But from para 25 onwards, they actually get into what is known as the entire evolution of public interest litigation in United Kingdom, in United States, as well as in India. The various facets of public interest litigation and how it evolved and how it impacts. And what are the maladies, what are the wrongdoings within that, and how do you rectify it? So that, in my view, is one of the most important latest judgment. Balwant Singh Chaufal versus it's 2013 SCC, 2010. 2010 3 SCC 402. 2010 volume 3 SCC page 402. That's the citation, but don't bother about it. We'll have this thing mailed to you all so that you all can have easy access to it. And just I would request from para 25 onwards, that is which is at page 423 till page 461, para 181. Read it properly till the last para. From para 25 onwards till the end, the entire concept of public interest litigation, uska history, the evolution, how it is currently manifesting itself, everything would be clear. And as a student of law, it's very important to understand the impact of public interest litigation, because several principles have emanated out of public interest litigation. The precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, the stricter than strict liability principle, the public trust doctrine principle, all these principles have been all evolved via public interest litigation. It's a very important source of case law in our country. And we are bound by case law. When we say that we are a common law country. Now, what is a common law country? A common law country is that the laws, the judgments of the Supreme Court have the same effect and same impact of a law made by the parliament or by the legislature. For example, you have the Union Parliament which makes a law. You have the Telangana Assembly which makes a law. So therefore, whatever Supreme Court passes a judgment, that judgment is also holding the same force of a law passed by the Parliament or by the Assembly. So therefore, this is an important source of law. It's not merely a case law. It is also a law in itself, the law laid down by the Supreme Court. So therefore, if you understand this one judgment, beautifully everything has been accepted. So that will go a long way in clarifying your fundas and clarifying your concepts about PIL. So I guess I think that is all that I had to say on the PIL. I'll be very happy to take questions on PIL. And after we finish those questions, then we can go to the next topic, that is anti-defection.
Sure, sir. So we have two questions come up. So Lakshmi has asked, sir, in your example, if the person has filed a petition against the admission process, where his kid is also interested, but the petition is signed by other people too, can that be considered as a PIL?
So if I've understood correctly, there is a petition filed by Mr. A, and it has other co-petitioners B, C, and D, and only Mr. A's kid is interested. B, C, and D's kids would not be are not interested. Then still, insofar as Mr. A goes, it would not be considered as a public interest litigation. Then probably he'll have to delete himself from the array of parties and let only those people who are not, whose children are not interested in the admission. Probably only he would have to allow only them to continue with the petition.
Moving on to the next question. Suraj has asked, is there any test laid down by the Apex Court to filter out the relevant and the important PILs filed on behalf of the interest of the people from the ones that serve as a tool to misuse such PILs?
Yeah, so Suraj, that's exactly, that's a good question. And this is exactly what I was trying to tell you in Balwant Singh Chaufal's case. They have laid down in para 181 of that judgment, they have laid down the various tests by which the courts, when they are faced with a PIL, should apply those tests to filter out the ones which are genuine PILs vis-a-vis ones which are motivated or fraudulent PILs. See, ultimately, there are no hard and fast rules and there is no formula. I mean, it's not like a chemistry lab where you apply some solution and it turns red, and if you don't apply, and if you apply a different solution, it will turn blue. So there is no chemical formula here, no scientific formula. Ultimately, the judges have to use their discretion, the judges have to use their experience, their wisdom. But broadly, as in Balwant Singh Chaufal's case, there are various guidelines laid by the Supreme Court. Also, Supreme Court's own registry, and therefore most of the high courts over the country, when you file a public interest litigation, you have to submit certain advance information. For example, you have to say that you are not connected in any manner with the subject matter. Secondly, you have to also say that what is your interest in it? What pursuit have you done in this area? What are your income tax returns? Are you somebody who has just being set up by somebody else or no? So there are around half a dozen certain questions and documents that the court asks for you to file before you actually they can entertain a PIL. So there are some sort of filtering processes, but then it's not very strict, and it can't be very strict because the nature of the jurisdiction is such that you can't have a clear formula. You know, there is obviously going to be some amount of number of PILs which are filed in a motivated manner, but they have such an overwhelming public interest involved that becomes difficult to filter them out. So they try it, but broadly it's not possible. Yes. Any other question you have on this?
Yes, sir. So Shrishti has the question. So, sir, how public interest litigation is being misused as a political and publicity interest litigation?
Yeah, she's right. That is what's happened. You know, nowadays what happens is that you file any damn petition under the sun on any given topic, like on Sushant Singh Rajput's unfortunate death. There were half a dozen PILs filed in the Supreme Court. People who probably haven't even seen one movie of his. They were the first ones to rush to the Supreme Court. So when you rush to the Supreme Court, your name comes next day in the paper. Oh, Mr. So-and-so has filed a PIL in the Supreme Court. And then what happens is, because it comes in the paper, the judges get interested. Their names also appear in the papers. They also get that publicity and that mileage. So even if they have to dismiss it, they will still listen to it for some time and then they will dismiss it. So therefore, this public interest litigation has developed into a publicity interest litigation. You know, that's a very massive publicity element. Also, on the political aspect, she's right. You know, there are so many cases which are guided purely by political motives. Now, what Supreme Court says is that, see, supposing there is a fraud committed by a political party and an opposition political party is going to come to the court. So you can file a public interest litigation, no doubt about it, but you have to disclose it. Disclose your locus, disclose your background, saying that, say, I am a member of political party B, I am against the policies of political party A, and the political party A, which is in government, has done so many A and B, C things, which are going to be negative impact, a negative influence on public interest, and therefore I have come. So you have to be upfront. You can be upfront. It's not that if you are from the opposite party, the court will refuse to entertain a PIL. Of course, the court will entertain PIL provided the subject matter is genuine. But many a times they don't even do that. They don't disclose all that. They just say that, oh, we are a public spirited citizen and everything under the sun, because there is no filtering process. See, as I gave the example, when you're interested in an admission to a college, or it's your flat against whom you have to file an eviction petition, there has to be some connection, some locus standi. In PIL, there is no locus standi. For example, as we speak, just to give a broad example, and I hope I'm not giving any wrong ideas to anybody, there can be a PIL filed tomorrow against your college and university for inviting me in the webinar. Even that can be a subject matter of a PIL. That why was this gentleman invited for a PIL? So they can be. So there is no restriction on the topic of a subject matter of a PIL. There is no restriction on who can file it. There is no restriction on what topic you can file it. So therefore, it's a double-edged sword. So if it can cause great deal of benefit, it can also cause great deal of nuisance. And these days, it's unfortunately causing more nuisance than benefit. Yes, Shishti.
So the next question comes in from Aditya Jha. Sir, you mentioned in the PIL misuse example that the company which did not get the tender accused the beneficiary of that tender with malicious background like bribing, tax fraud, etc. Is it not important to know what grounds are tenders being allotted?
No, see, that would be a separate issue. Now, if there is some violation of the tender process, now, for example, if I have submitted a bid and I feel my bid is the best bid, but the government does not give it to me and gives it to Aditya's company, surely I'm entitled to file a writ petition in the courts and say that, see, I have been wrongly denied. So law does not say that you can't come to the court. You can come to the court. But assuming the example that I gave is a situation whereby the entire tendering process has gone off lawfully, and this company which has lost does not have a legal ground to challenge the award of the tender to its rival, the successful company, then what it shall do? See, supposing if there is some problem in that tendering process itself, then that company does not need some hidden person to come forward and file a PIL. Then the company can itself file a writ petition. But supposing that process is clean, there is no problem with the process, but you don't want that company to get the tender, because if that rival company gets the tender, you lose out. So therefore, this aspect of public interest litigation, where you throw dirt at the successful company, bringing into extraneous things other than the tender processes to bring down the reputation of the company and put a stay order on the performance of that tender. So that is how there's a difference between a writ petition and a PIL.
So the next question comes in from Preeti. Sir, how different is judicial activism or adventurism from PIL? And are there any suggestions or models to keep up the over-activist judiciary in check?
So I think you'll have to ask the Supreme Court judges for that. How do they keep the overactive judiciary in check? I think that the politicians are trying to find a way out for several decades now. They've failed. And so, once they get a formula to keep the overactive judiciary in check, I'll definitely tell you that. But by then she herself would be a lawyer and she'd know. But so, but on a more serious side, see, this concept of an overactive judiciary, it's a very subjective concept. I mean, as in there is no threshold. For example, in cricket, those who follow cricket, see 150 kilometers se upar jo bowling dalta hai is considered to be as a fast bowler. You see, so there is a threshold. There is a speed limit. Below 140, 150 kilometers, you are not a fast bowler. Above that, you are a fast bowler. Then you have a threshold. Say, for example, if you get 90% marks, then it's considered to be exceptional. If you get less than 90, it is considered to be very good. So there are objective standards for various things. So similarly, there are no objective standards to measure the activism, either under activism or over activism of judges in the Supreme Court or in any other court. So first and foremost, you must understand that what you consider as overactive court, someone else, in fact, your own classmate may consider it to be as an underactive court, that no, these guys are shirking their responsibility. You may feel that you're doing more than what's required and they're transgressing into areas which they should not. Someone else, your own classmate, may feel that no, sorry, they're not doing enough. They are being very timid. They are being cowardly. They should go more hammer and tongs. So first and foremost, please understand this entire concept of an overactive judiciary or judicial activism is nothing but a subjective concept. It differs from time to time, place to place, case to case. And secondly, in India's concept, you see why judiciary has had a bigger role compared to judiciaries in other countries is because Unfortunately, there are the three main organs of government that you know: legislature, executive, and judiciary. There are unfortunately instances where the legislature and executive themselves are remiss. They themselves keep so much the gaps, lacunas, and shortcomings in the performance of their duties. And then this forces the judiciary to enter into that arena. Like, for example, pollution is a classic case. Now, why should the Supreme Court be involved into pollution so heavily, passing so many laws and so many thousands of man hours have been spent into these matters? Isn't the government sensitive about it? Shouldn't the government be the first ones to take care of it? Do they take care of it? When you drive down from Hyderabad to your airport, do you feel that there are no violations of any environmental norms? Are the roads in perfect shape? Is the municipal authority doing its job well? No. So that's the saddest part. The various government authorities, they themselves fail in performance of their duties. And when they fail in the performance of the duties, which by law they have to do, then what will a citizen do? You see, supposing there's an expressway built from your college to the airport, the Rajiv Gandhi International Airport, and that expressway in the very second year develops potholes. You don't manage to reach in time. It's a terrible journey from your campus to the airport. You miss your flights or your car gets damaged. What do? You see, where is the redress? Because the very authority that had to build a perfect, impeccable highway has actually duped you. So therefore, there is no option left for you but to bring it to the notice of the court. Now the court can say that, sorry, this is not my job, this is the government's job. The government has to make the road. You please go back to the government. Or the courts might say, sorry, this is a sheer criminal wastage of public funds, and we will take the people to task whosoever has done this. So what would you call that judiciary who does the second order? Would you call it an overactive judiciary? And the judiciary which passed the first order of non-interfering, would you call that an underactive judiciary? So these are subjective concepts. This is what you must understand. So it's very easy for us to tag it as overactive or no. But yes, compared to other jurisdictions, other civilized jurisdictions, our Supreme Court or our High Courts have been known to be more proactive. And that's because of the peculiar circumstances we face in India, not because the judges may necessarily be keen to assume a larger role for themselves. Many a times they are forced to assume a larger role because we approach because we have no option. They are the last resort. They are the last resort for protection of our rights, protection of our constitutional rights, and for democracy. So I hope that answers your question on overactivism.
Yes, sir. So next question is by Priyal. Sir, how is it adjudged by the court whether the matter is of public interest or not?
So I think you either missed my earlier part, whatever I was saying, or you just switched off the mic along with the camera, and that is muted me. See, just to come back what I told at the start, the doctrine is whether every petition would have the prayer clause. Okay, so that's a very simple test that I'll give you. When you go to the prayer clause, if the court were to allow that prayer clause, grant the relief that you're asking in the prayer clause, are you, that is the petitioner before the court filing a writ petition, are you going to be benefited by it directly or no? That's the litmus test. I gave you the example that if I were to file a writ petition and someone of my relative were to get an admission in a college, if my writ petition succeeds, then it is not a public interest litigation, it becomes a private litigation. But if I file a writ petition and because if the prayers are allowed, I don't benefit. You may benefit, the entire country may benefit, but I personally don't benefit. Then that becomes a public interest litigation. The idea is the final relief and you should have no connection. Only then it's a public interest litigation. Rupal, yes?
So the next question comes in by Shamant. Sir, in today's times, that is after 2000, is there any example of any letters that have been converted into public interest litigation? As there are many citizens who are poor people and who cannot afford or are not aware as to how to file a PIL. So the only thing they can do is of letter addressed to the CJI when they see a public wrong.
Yes, they may not have received that wide publicity because, see, these days we have a very hyperactive media. So quite of the earlier things when media was not that prevalent, we didn't have 24/7 television channels or we didn't have newspapers and social media. So those times you had to resort to a letter or a postcard. These days, invariably the news appears in either the electronic media or the print media. And then that becomes the basis for the court to initiate a suo motu writ petition. Those suo motu writ petitions also are in the nature of public interest. Difference being that instead of a litigant coming to the court itself initiates that. So they also in the nature a branch of public interest litigations. So therefore you have a lot of you do have it these days. And for example, in the case of say law students, when in I don't know whether you've been following it in Bombay, you know, where they were planning to break down a few trees, in fact, quite a few trees for building a metro shed at RA, at the forest area in Bombay. And there were law students who wrote a letter to the Chief Justice, and based on the letters, a suo motu PIL was initiated. So there have been instances. It's not that this jurisprudence is totally dead, but because now news is far greater to find, very easy to disseminate, easier to access. Therefore, the courts need not rely upon a postcard or a letter before they have to swing into action. Many a times, newspaper reports itself constitute a good ground for initiating PIL.
Yes,
yeah, Rupal?
So the last question on PIL comes in by Nandini. Sir, are there any separate tribunals for dealing with PILs? And if not, do you think it's a viable possibility?
Nandini, see, there are no, the answer to your question, the short answer is no. There are no tribunals, separate tribunals for PIs, and there's a reason for it, which I was just telling in the earlier part of my talk here, that a public interest litigation can be filed only in the High Court under Article 226, or it can be filed in the Supreme Court under Article 32. I mean, those of you all who watched Jolly LLB, I don't know how many of you all watched it. In a district court, a PIL was filed, by Arshad Varsi, that first movie of Jolly LLB. So you don't have PILs in district courts. Let's be very clear on that. So public interest litigations, because see, there is not public interest litigation does not have a separate identity of its own. Public interest litigations are essentially writ petitions. Please understand that. You have writs. Writ petitions are of two types. One type would be where you are privately interested in the remedy. So that becomes a writ petition, simpliciter, a simple writ petition. Second type of writ petitions are where you're not privately interested in that, where you're doing it for a public cause. Those writ petitions get the nomenclature of a PIL. Or if the Supreme Court or the High Court suo motu initiates anything, that also becomes the nature of a PIL. So it is essentially a writ that you have to file. And only when you file the writ and satisfy the court that I have no personal interest involved, does that become a public interest litigation. So by the very nature of the remedy, by the very nature of the petition that you are filing, you have to file it in the High Court or the Supreme Court. And therefore, there aren't any tribunals. Like, for example, if you have to sit for an MBA exam, then you sit for CAT, isn't it? So CAT is an exam for MBAs. So you can't aspire to get admission, say in IIM Ahmedabad, without sitting for CAT, isn't it? So the same logic applies here. So you can't aspire to file a petition, can't aspire to file a public interest litigation unless you don't file a writ petition. And a writ petition, by its very nature in our constitution, can be filed only before the High Court under Article 226 or only before the Supreme Court under Article 32. So these are the courts with exclusive jurisdiction. Therefore, there are no separate tribunals. Maybe tomorrow she is right, as in you never know, Parliament may come up with a law, create a special tribunal saying that, sorry, only writ petitions to go before the High Court, Supreme Court. And if you want to file a PIL, this is a separate tribunal that we have created. They can do that. Parliament is very well capable of doing that. But up till now, that thing hasn't been done. And there is no tribunal aspect in this. It goes to the High Court or the Supreme Court. Rupal?
So we can move on with anti-defection now.
Yeah, so I hope the answers are broadly satisfactory. If there are any follow-up questions, or if there is something that has troubled anybody, we can quickly just respond to that and finish it off. If anyone has all those people who have asked me a question, if there is any follow-up question or anything that is still unclear. Nobody? Rupal, all clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, take it. So then we move to anti-defection. Now, see, what is anti-defection? See, anti-defection is, to put it very simply, again, just to get into the very basics. We have elections. We have elections to the, say, multiple forms of elections, but let's restrict ourselves to elections to the Legislative Assembly. So you have the Telangana Legislative Assembly, where Hyderabad is located, where you have KCR, who's the chief minister, and you have the parliament, where Mr. Narendra Modi is the prime minister. So when elections are held, in our country, we have what is known as a party-based democracy. So political parties contest elections. So we have the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party right now. You have the Congress. We have regional parties like TRS, the Telangana Rashtriya Samiti, or other national parties like the Communist parties, or other regional parties elsewhere. You have Mamata Banerjee's party in West Bengal, Uddhav Thackeray's party in Maharashtra, and so on and so forth. So these parties contest elections, and then their nominees win what is known as an MLA seat or a member of parliament seat. And whosoever wins the highest number of seats, whichever party gets the highest number of seats, or whichever coalition of party gets the highest number of seats, they ultimately form the government. Now, once having formed the government, supposing there in a given assembly there are say 200 seats. Out of 200, the minimum cutoff to form the government say would be 100, 101 would be 50%. So a political party gets 101, the other political party gets 99. I'm just giving a very rough, very hypothetical example. It doesn't happen. The other political parties also would win seats. But let's assume that there is an assembly which has 200 seats and only two parties have successful in getting the seats. Party A gets 101 seats, party B gets 99 seats. So obviously party A would form the government, party B would have to sit in the opposition. Now party B is not happy to sit in the opposition. Party B kya karta hai? It lures 5 people from party A to join them. 106 minus 5 kitna hua? 96. 99 plus 5 kitna hua? 104. So now who will form the government? Party B. Party A government goes out and party B government comes in. So this tendency of these 5 MLAs who shift from one party to another party is known as defection. They have defected from the original party from where they were elected to some other party. Now this problem started taking place in India in the 1960s, in the mid 1960s. We had a first parliamentary election in 1952. So from 52 to the mid 60s, say roughly for a period of 15 years, we still had very good quality leaders, leaders who had fought for India against the British during the independence movement. So they were not in politics for making money, a quick buck, and the hundreds of crores that netas these days make. They were those leaders who were there who had sacrificed immensely for the country. So we were fortunate to have that generation which created the constitution for us, which laid the foundation of this modern nation for us. And we didn't have this malady of defections then. But come the mid 60s, when the next generation, the once post-independent generation of Indians started coming, this malady started coming. That there used to be a very famous principle, the phrase of Ayaram Gayaram. Now, Ayaram Gayaram came from an MLA in Haryana in 1967. In one single day, the gentleman changed 3 parties. Imagine, in one day, Mr. Gayaram changed 3 parties. So what will be the stability of any government with the MLAs start shifting like this? Morning they are with one party, that they form the government the next day. The day after they leave that party and they go to some other party, that government falls, some other government comes in. The third day they would leave that party and join some other party, and that government falls and some other formation comes up. So this is not healthy for democracy. What sort of administration will take place? Look at the amount of corruption that will take place if you permit such sort of defections. So therefore, after grappling with this crisis for almost 20 years, and it took 20 years for the parliament to address this problem. Imagine, that's the reason why, to relate the earlier answer of overactivism judiciary, this is why one has to approach the judiciary. Because it took 20 years for the parliament to create a law on this subject, and that law ultimately was created in 1985. There was an amendment in the constitution, the 52nd amendment, 52nd amendment in the constitution in 1985, whereby you had what is known as the 10th schedule that was inserted in the Constitution of India. You had the Anti-Defection Act, which is known as the 10th schedule. So you have the Constitution of India, the 395 odd articles, and then after those articles ends, then you have various schedules, schedule 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you go to the 10th schedule, you will find the Anti-Defection Act there. So it's not found in any article of the Constitution. It's a separate annexe, separate codicil, a separate part of the Constitution, which is known as the 10th schedule, and where Parliament inserted this. Now, what is 10th schedule, or what is Anti-Defection Act? Anti-Defection Act basically creates certain barriers that you cannot shift parties so easily. So in 1985, when this law came into the picture, the parliament laid the law that in order for any defection to be considered to be as valid, minimum 1/3 of that party members have to leave. Only then it's a valid defection, or rather it's a valid move. Now, to give the same example that I gave earlier, in an assembly of 200 people, party A, which has won 101 seat, party B has won only 99 seats. Now, once before 1985, as I said, 5 people could easily jump. Government of party A falls, government of party B comes. But after the 1985 Anti-Defection Act and the 10th schedule of the Constitution came into force, there was under para 3 of the 10th schedule, there was a limit of minimum 1/3. So any figure less than 1/3, if they shift, then they will be kicked out of the assembly or the parliament, they'll be disqualified. So you're no longer MLAs, you're no longer MPs, so therefore you cannot now join some other party or become mantris. You see, so that threshold was 1/3. So in a party of 101, it was not possible for only 5 people to shift. They needed 1/3 of the strength. 1/3 of 101 would be minimum roughly around 34. So only when you have 34 MLAs can 34 MLAs shift from party A and join party B, and then that shift would be considered to be as a valid shift. But supposing instead of 34, you have only 32. Forget 5, 6, 7. I go right up till 32. And 32 people want to leave, 32 MLAs want to leave party A and want to come to party B. But they are not 1/3, they are falling short by 1 MLA. All 32 people will be disqualified. So they are out. They are out of the assembly. So it may happen that party A government will still fall, because from 101, if you minus 32 people out, so they will obviously fall short of numbers compared to party B, which has 99 members. But what will happen is that those defecting MLAs will not be able to enjoy the fruit of their office. They will no longer be MLAs. They will not draw the salaries of MLAs. They will not get the bungalow of MLAs. They will not have the emoluments, perks, MLA funds, or they will not get to become ministers. So that is the deterrent, because ultimately you shift because of all these things. You want to become a minister and you want better prospects and so on and so forth. So that is what Anti-Defection Act did in 1985. It created a threshold of 1/3. But the law is made by the parliament, and the parliament always underestimates the ingenuity of their own parliamentarians. Whether the parliamentarians become more smart than their earlier generation who created these laws. So earlier it was 1% shifting, 2% shifting. Now what is to happen is that they just raise the stakes, raise the amount of money they needed to purchase the MLAs, and 1/3 is to rampantly shift. So now in 2003 there was a further amendment in the Constitution, the 91st Amendment, and the 91st Amendment scrapped what is known as the para 3 of the 10th schedule, meaning thereby now 1/3 people can't shift. Now under para 4, 2/3 people need to shift. So just see that, so pre 1985, no threshold limit, even one MLA could shift. From 1985 to 2003, that is till the 91st Amendment didn't come into the picture, the threshold was 1/3. From 2003 till date, the threshold is 2/3. So this is what, gradually they have been increasing the threshold, trying to make it more difficult. So now with regards to anti-defection, the main case law in this, the original case law is Quixoto Holohan, is a judgment of 5 judges, 1992 supplementary to SCC 651. So Quixoto's judgment, of course, we'll have that judgment also mailed, so don't worry about that. So under PIL, we'll have Balwant Singh Chaufal, and then this is the second judgment that I'll send on Quixoto Holohan. And the third judgment that I'll send you is a very recent judgment of 2020, Justice Ramanna's judgment in the Karnataka Assembly's case. Srimant Balasaheb, just send that. So these are the 3 case laws that I'd like you all to send. So anybody who's interested in this aspect, if you read these 3 case laws, you would be more than, and read them well, read them 3 times, 4 times, 5 times if you have to. But please read them, analyze them, ingest them well. If you do so, you will have a certain degree of mastery on that topic. You'll understand all the facets. So I'm giving you a case law because under anti-defection, there will be 25 judgments of the Supreme Court. You don't need to go through all of them right now. Even if you go through this one judgment, say the latest 2020 judgment also very well, minutely, that should suffice. So if I have to point out one single judgment for the two topics of discussion today, for PILs, please go through Balwant Singh Chaufal, 2010 Supreme Court. For anti-defection, please go through 2020 Shrimant Balasaheb Patil, that is Justice N.V. Ramanna's judgment, who will be the next Chief Justice of India after Justice Bobde retires in April 2021. So this is what anti-defection essentially is. They have just raised the bar of ensuring that the defections don't take place that easily. And this is to ensure that there is no money play, there is no, because if you have all these undesirable traits in the assembly or the parliament, where you buy and sell MLAs with using your money power or with using force, pressure, so on and so forth, and that's very detrimental to democracy. So in order to preserve democratic values, the Anti-Defection Act has come into force. But unfortunately, my personal experience has been, and I've done a fair amount of cases on anti-defection, it hasn't worked, because no matter what law you bring about, our MLAs and MPs, as I said, are more ingenious. You can never underestimate their ingenuity. They always come up with different ways and means to evade the existing laws and still do what they're doing it. And there have been several recent judgments on this, and so one of the ways to get around, one ingenious and innovative way to get around this is, now you don't have 2/3. So what do? How do you get the government down? We saw this example in Karnataka. We saw it in Karnataka in 2019. We saw it in Madhya Pradesh in 2020, and we almost saw it in Rajasthan last month. So what is the new technique that the MLAs have come up with? Now, for example, to constitute a valid split, you need 2/3. Now, say 101, as I gave the earlier example. From 101, 2/3 would mean not 34. It would mean 66, 67 MLAs. So out of 101, if party B wants to break 101 MLAs and form the government, it can do so only if 67 out of 101 MLAs decide to shift. Now, that's a tall order. I mean, howsoever liberal our netas might be in terms of their value system, they certainly aren't that easy and that liberal enough that you can get 67 out of 101 on your side. So what do you do? So in Karnataka in 2019, there was a new formula that came about, which was replicated very successfully in even before that in Goa in 2017, in Manipur, in Arunachal, and earlier this year in March in Madhya Pradesh, where supposing party B, which is 99, which is just needs 2-3 MLAs to form the government, what it would say, it would ask 5 MLAs from party A to resign. Just understand this. So as things stand today under the 10th schedule, the earlier example that I gave, that 5 MLAs shift from party A and join party B, that is not permissible now after 1985. That was the pre-1985 status. In 2020, after 2003, after the 91st Amendment came, 2/3 have to shift. 2/3 means it's a tall order to get so many people to your party, but you don't need 2/3. You only may need, say, 4 or 5 or 10 people, 10 MLAs. But you can't ask them to join you, because the moment they join you and they are less than the 2/3 threshold, they'll be disqualified. So you get no benefit. So therefore, of course, the MLAs aren't willing to be disqualified. So therefore, what their new strategy they have come out with is to resign. We saw that in Karnataka, and we saw that this year in Madhya Pradesh, where the party in power, certain MLAs of that party in power resigned from their seats. Because they resigned, the strength of the party in power that fell down. And the party which was in opposition, whose strength remained intact, they sat in the government and they sat on the CM's chair. So that's one way now of getting around the rigors of 10th schedule. You see, so in this example, say party A has 101 seats, party B has 99 seats, but parties B government is also there at the center and they have the full support, from the center, machinery, everything. So what they will do, they will ask 5 MLAs from party A to resign. So once they resign, so the strength of party A falls from 101, say, to 96. But party's B strength has remained intact. It is 99. So therefore, party A loses the chief minister's chair, loses the government, and party B comes now inside the government. And then what about those 5 guys? Those 5 guys, when they resign, within 6 months, the election commission has to hold by-elections. Now they will get the ticket of party B. You see, if they were disqualified, they could not have contested elections for 6 years. But now, because they have because they are now as MLAs, they can contest as MLAs because if the resignation is accepted, they contest as candidates of party B, get elected within 6 months, come back to the assemblies and become ministers of party B's government. So this is one very easy way. So party B, which under the 10th schedule had to get hold of 67 MLAs, today can get only 2, 3, 5, 10 MLAs to resign and their purpose is achieved. So this is one way, and there is no answer to this because the courts also are helpless. There is no law made on this because Parliament, every MLA or MP has the right to resign. So you can't say that, oh, we will prevent you from resigning, that once you get elected for all 5 years, you have to remain MLA, you have to remain MLA, MP, you can't resign. So that can't be done. You, a legislature or a parliamentarian has the right to resign. He resigns, the government falls, then the new government comes in. So this is the problem that we are facing now. This is the new threat to the Anti-Defection Act and to democracy at large, for which there are no answers because the court has not been able to find a mechanism to stop this, and neither is a law yet made by the parliament to solve this problem. So this is what broadly I would like to say on anti-defection. And there are any queries, and in fact, Rupal, I'm in fact open to also, if supposing there are questions with regards to some general practice also just outside this specific topic, if there's something which is very urgent or which is disturbing anyone who would like to ask any question, feel free to ask that also. But don't feel inhibited or restricted in any manner. Rupal, please, you can have the question.
Sure.
Yep.
So we have one question by Srishti. These days, we often witness the parties camping their MLAs in resorts, fearing defection. What is your take on resort democracy in the light of anti-defection laws?
No one invited me to a resort, so I have no take on this. You see, that's the saddest part. But on a more serious note, of course, this is money play. Who's paying for this? So you must understand. See, a resort is not cheap. You see. And these MLAs are supposed to be public servants. I mean, they are not high-flying businessmen or high-flying lawyers and doctors and who earn in crores of rupees annually. They have a very meager income. So who is funding them? You have chartered planes picking them up from place A and taking them to place B. Chartered planes, see, a Delhi to Hyderabad chartered plane would cost you 5 lakhs. 5 lakhs, one chartered plane. And this we are talking only of a 5-seater or a 7-seater. If you're going to take a normal a Boeing 737-800, that would come up to 15 lakhs. So imagine the kind of money that is spent just to transport them. Then you stay in a hotel, in a resort, per day, per head, it's at least 50,000. And they stay there for weeks together, and quite a few of them. So across party lines, I'm not saying that one specific party, every party is indulging in resort politics, and this resort politics comes at a heavy price. Someone is obviously paying the price. Someone is footing the bill, and whosoever is footing the bill is not doing charity. He is going to take his pound of flesh subsequently, and when he takes his pound of flesh, from where is that flesh going to come? It's from you and me, the common citizens. We are going to be fleeced in order to foot this bill. You see, so assuming there are criminals or businessmen who are footing this bill, these humongous bills that are there for resort politics, they're obviously going to ask for favors in return. And when favors are given to them, it's at cost of public interest. So a road which should have been built, say, in 1 crore will be built in 5 crores. An airport which should have been built, say, in 100 crores will be built in 200 crores. A building of a public institution which should have been built, say, in 5 crores will be built in 10 crores and with half as good quality. So this is the root cause of endemic corruption in our country, because we have not been able to divorce money and our politicians. Because today, one of the easiest and the quickest way of making a buck is politics. That's the reason why you also get these dynastic politics. Why there is so much of attraction for dynastic politics in our country? Because there is humongous amount of money to be made. See, politicians all over the world make it. But the kind of money that is made in India, the proportion or the quantity of money that is to be made in India is far in excess to, say, other developed or civilized world. That's the reason why you want to make it a family enterprise. And this resort politics is nothing but a manifestation as to how much of money power has a role to play in our politics. Our netas may profess that they are very virtuous and they are very conscientious, etc., etc., and they are different from the past. But there's no different from the past. It's the same thing. How do you, engineer? How do you ensure that the government falls and a new government comes in? Do you think these MLAs have suddenly resigned out of conscience? They suddenly realize that no, this CM is very bad CM and he should go and some other CM should come. There has been no, I mean, as in even a third year, fourth year, fifth year law student that you guys are, you guys also would not buy it, let alone, people who have spent a few years in this profession. That of course not. These MLAs have shifted because they have received money. The resort politics is there. So this is actually very bad advertisement for our democracy. I'm glad this question was asked about resort politics, because unfortunately that's what our 10th schedule has now become. It's just become resort politics. That's the way to get around 10th schedule. Rupal?
So the next question comes in from Aditya Jha.
Mm-hmm.
So can you please explain a little about the Maharashtra elections?
See, in Maharashtra election, what happened was we have the concept of floor test. So supposing there is, as the elections took place in Maharashtra last year in October, and there were around 288 seats in Maharashtra Assembly, and BJP and Shiv Sena fought in a pre-election electoral alliance. So there was an alliance between these two parties, BJP and Shiv Sena, before the elections. After the elections results came, BJP got around 104 seats, Shiv Sena got around 64 seats. 104 plus 64 would be 168, 170, which is safely above the halfway mark of 144. So in an assembly of 288, if you have to form the government, you need 50 plus 1, that is 50% plus 1, that is 144 plus 1, that is 145. These two alliance partners had 168. So normally and in usual course, their government should have been installed. But after the election results came, there was a dispute between these two parties as to who would become the chief minister. BJP said that since it has got the larger number of seats, its nominee would become the chief minister, that is Mr. Fadnavis. Shiv Sena said that sorry, when our seat alliance was discussed before the elections were there, you had given us a promise, you as in BJP had given your word that irrespective which party wins what seat, chief minister's chair will go to the Shiv Sena party. So this was a dispute which they could not resolve. They had several rounds of meetings, talks, etc. Then what happened was party number 3 and 4 in Maharashtra, that is party number 3 was NCP, which got around 50 odd seats. Party number 4 was Congress, which got around 40 odd seats. So Shiv Sena, NCP and Congress got together. So 60 plus of Shiv Sena, 50 plus of NCP and 40 plus of Congress together would have crossed for 145. Now the governor is a nominee of the governor has been appointed by the central government, and the central government obviously was keen to ensure that their party's government is installed. So once they got a whiff of this, that Shiv Sena, NCP and Congress are getting into an alliance and they are going to stake a claim to form the government before the governor. Overnight, the governor sworn in Mr. Fadnavis as the chief minister and gave him 21 days to prove his majority in the assembly. Now, prove his majority means that within 21 days of being sworn in, you have to seek a vote of confidence. That is, you have to prove that in an assembly of 288, you have the support of more than 144 members. Now, another, just to take this resort politics further, when you have this 21-day period, when you have this long gap between the date of being sworn in as a chief minister and the date on which you have to take oath as the, or rather prove your majority, that gives you sufficient time to quote unquote buy MLAs, or it's called horse trading. So horse trading is nothing but you give inducements, threats, money, you give them offer of ministership, etc., whatever it takes, but get them to your side. And then you manage to continue as the chief minister. Now that is something that the Supreme Court has always looked down upon, because if the governor has sworn you in, then presumably you have the majority. If you have the majority, why do you need 21 days for that? You should be in a position to prove it within 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours at best logistically to get all the MLAs at one place and have the voting done. So therefore, once Mr. Fadnavis's government was sworn in, I think it was 22nd of November 2019. I was the advocate on record. We drafted a writ petition against it. We filed it in the Supreme Court on behalf of of the Shiv Sena, NCP and the Congress party, saying that firstly, he doesn't have the numbers, so he should not have been sworn in. In any case, if he has the numbers, if he claims he has the numbers, jolly well, that's good luck to him. He can't be given 21 days. He should be asked to prove it immediately, because this is what the Supreme Court has done in its earlier case laws. So on 26th of November, within 4 days after arguments were heard on a daily basis, including on the weekend, Saturday and well as on Sunday, Supreme Court came up with a direction on 26th November in the morning saying that you have the floor test within 2 days on 28th of November. And this is where resort politics comes in, that till the time the floor test is not done, the parties take their respective MLAs to a resort so that there is no poaching, there is no horse trading. If you can't contact the MLA, then where are you going to buy him? Or how are you going to buy him? So the idea is to keep him wrapped up, keep him incommunicado. No telephones, no WhatsApp, no email, no Insta, for example. Yeah, absolutely no connection, no contact, and see that they just come on the day of voting to the assembly. So resort politics took place even there. And then when Supreme Court gave this order that within 2 days you have to form your government, you have to prove your majority rather, Mr. Fadnavis realized that he didn't have the numbers and he very gracefully resigned. So this is the problem. This is the problem where the governors unfortunately don't follow, and the law in this case is S.R. Bomai's case, 9 judges of the Supreme Court in 1994. They have laid down this law that whenever there is a dispute, you see, it's not rocket science. Whenever there is a dispute that which formation, which party or which group of parties or coalition of parties have a majority, the best way to do that is the floor test. Have it on the floor of the House, have it as immediately as possible. And as they say in Hindi, it's a very old phrase, doodh ka doodh, pani ka pani. So you straight away can decide who's in power, who has the numbers, who doesn't have the numbers. If I have staked a claim before the governor to form the government, if I am telling the governor today on 22nd of August that I have the numbers and please swear me in as the chief minister, then on the very day, next morning itself, I should be able to prove a majority. Because when you have the majority, you submit a claim. No? See, it's like once the results are out and you are the first ranker, you are the topper, only then will you be given the medal and the trophy. You can't be given the trophy first and then be told to sit for the exam and then come first. Isn't it? So that's logic is simple, that if I have the numbers, hence I have staked my claim. So if I have the numbers and I have staked the claim, then why do I need 21 days, 14 days, 15 days to prove it? It should happen immediately. And that's what Supreme Court says, that whenever there's a dispute, decide it on the floor of the House. The floor of the House is have the voting right inside the House and decide who has the numbers, who is the right to become the chief minister. And if you don't have the numbers, you shouldn't be sitting on the chief minister's chair even for one single day. That same logic applied to Mr. Kamal Nath in March in Madhya Pradesh's matter, where he lost the numbers and Supreme Court said that, sorry, you can't take 20 days to prove your majority. You have to prove it yourself within a day. And within the very next day, the Supreme Court told him to seek a vote of confidence, and he didn't have the number and he resigned. So I guess that answers hopefully the question. Rupal?
So the next question comes in by Samant. So what is your perspective can be done to stop defection?
You see, this is again a $1 million question. So, I mean, if there are no quick fix solutions, as in no matter what solution, if I may come up with, I'm very sure that our MLAs in the future will get around that, will mutate, will evolve, so, but offhand, having done these cases for some time, I think the first and foremost solution is the public standards, the public morals. We as a nation have very poor national character, and this is my personal view. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but this is my personal view that our national character is very poor. We get swayed. Our votes can easily be influenced in terms of cash, corruption, caste, communal slogans, religious slogans, provincialism, linguistic basis. These are all parochial tendencies on which our votes are cast. So therefore, once that person, that MLA represents our caste or our religion or our community, we turn a blind eye to whatever he does. Whether he is indulging in defection, whether he is making money. Now these very MLAs who defect, go from one party to another party, they stand for elections, liberally bribe their voters, and they get re-elected. The harsh fact of the matter is, no matter how much we may talk great things about a democracy, But for $500, a vote can be bought. For a sari, one vote can be bought. For a bottle of liquor, a vote can be bought. So this is the nature of our politics, where money power, corruption, muscle power, communal angle, caste angle, they all play a very important part. You know that a candidate is not worth being elected as an MLA, but still the vote goes to that candidate. Why? Because he's of your own caste, he's of your own religion. You'd rather vote a hopeless criminal gunda from your own caste and your own religion, rather than give that vote to a person of a different religion or a different caste, even though he may be deserving. So this is the reality of India. We all are in a very minuscule position. Ones who are listening to this, people like me, people like lawyers, who are practicing in the courts. So we would look at secular aspects, non-parochial aspects before casting our vote. But people like us are unfortunately in a minority in this country. The majority of people who vote on such flippant considerations. So when you are voting the wrong person, how will you ensure that the person remains straight? He is bound to create a problem. Today I'll give you a solution that yes, no resignation should be accepted, or if any MLA resigns for the next, he has a right to resign. But if any MLA resigns for next 2 terms, he should not be eligible to contest the elections. I have a quick fix solution to that. I have a solution. My solution is this, that by resignations, if you are going to make the government fall, any MLA after getting elected wants to resign, he should not be eligible to contest any elections for the next, say, 5 years, 7 years or 10 years. Put that embargo. So that will be a very, very big deterrent, because he's out of politics for 10 years if he resigns. So no one would want to do that. But even if this law would come and temporarily there would be a stop in defections, they would think of something else. So ultimately, today our netas lack value system because we lack it. They are reflection of us. They don't come from a separate planet. Our netas are elected by ones amongst us. We don't import our netas from planet Mars. So how do you solve that problem? They are a reflection of what we are. So first we have to solve our own problem. And once our problem is solved to a large extent, that problem will get solved. I hope. I'm sorry if I've given too much of a philosophical answer to this, but this is actually what I feel. I mean, I've just candidly shared my thoughts, and I'm sorry at the outset if I've offended anybody, because these are sensitive topics. Rupal?
So the next question comes in by Himani. So when it comes down to ground reality of the implementation of anti-defection law, has any court addressed the issue with the voters' perspective and the breach of their trust?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Could she please elaborate? What does she mean by breach of trust?
Yes, sir. Sir, I think we can ask her. Himani, can you please? So till then, we can move on to next question. Sir, Aditya has to ask, sir, can election commissions intervene to stop these things?
No, election commission's jurisdiction ends once the elections are conducted. After that, they have no role. So they are there only till the election process. That is election. Once a person gets elected as an MLA, election commission's roles end. Then after that, it is the assembly, that is the speaker of the legislative assembly or the speaker of the Lok Sabha. They are the ones who have to take charge of all these things. The EC has no role in this.
So the next question comes in by Shweta. Sir, I believe PIL actions may sometimes result in the problem of competing rights. For example, while any court orders who would direct the closure of industries, the interests and the rights of the workmen can get affected, and they might be deprived of their right to livelihood. Can you explain how this problem can be tackled?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sorry, who asked this question?
So Shweta.
Shweta, it's a good question. And this is where litigation is or rather judicial work is all about that, balancing the competing rights, because they will always see it's why law is so interesting, so fun, because there are no black and white. No one party can be said that it's 100% right. No other party can be said that it is 100% wrong. So I'll give you the example of Niyamgiri mines in Orissa, around 7-8 years ago, where Vedanta Industries wanted to invest 10,000 crores in building up a refinery where they wanted to source raw material from the forest areas. And this has got an airy reflection of that movie Avatar, the English movie Avatar that came about around 10 years ago, James Cameron's Avatar, where they wanted to mine that area which was very sacred to the native people there. They wanted to mine those forests so that they get a very crucial mineral, and this is always there in across all litigations. So even if PILs, I gave you a very simplistic example of people being motivated by ulterior consideration. There may be a case like this, for example, in a case like this where there is a multi-million-dollar company which genuinely and sincerely wants to invest in say an area which is say a forest area. They are ready to spend 10,000 crores. Look at the benefit to India's economy. Look at the benefit to local employment generation. Look at the overall benefits to the country, by such an immense investment. But on the other hand, putting up a plant in that area, because they have to put a plant close to the raw material, only then it makes financial sense. Supposing आपने एक फैक्ट्री खोला हैदराबाद में and the raw material is based in Assam, how do you transport that raw material from Assam to Hyderabad? In the transportation itself, the entire project becomes unviable. You see, so the idea is these big industries have to be located close to the source of their raw materials. Aluminium, iron ore, coal, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the source of these raw materials are our traditional ecosystems like forests and public parks and sanctuaries. So these are competing claims. You have to balance it. On one side of the competing claim is the imperative of economic development. On the other hand of the competing claim are the considerations for environmental protection. So the pro-industry group would say, you give 10,000 crores of industry, someone is investing 10,000 crores. Look at the benefit to India's economy. Look at the number of lakhs of people who will get employment. They will get jobs, their economic standards will get uplifted, will get so many goods cheaper, and so on and so forth. This is the pro-industry lobby saying. But the pro-environment lobby will say that to build this factory of 10,000 crores, you will have to destroy 10 square kilometers of forests. These are rare forests. These are ecosystems in which the tribal communities have been living for hundreds of years. You will have to uproot them. Where will they go? If you just demolish all the trees in our ecosystems, you are actually creating a massive greenhouse gases emission problem. The planet itself won't survive. When planet itself won't survive, तो आप economic development लेके क्या करोगे आप? Now you tell, do we have a glib answer to this? Is there an immediate answer to this? Can we say that the industry group is 100% right? Or can we say that the tribal group or the pro-forest group is 100% wrong? No, both of them are right in their own ways. So this is where at some point of time, the courts have to balance it out. And this balancing is where an astute judge or a wise judge under public interest litigation comes into the picture, where they have to try and what is known as the environment impact assessment. So there's a formula for this, that when any industry comes, what is the negative impact of that industry on the environment? So you do a test known as an EIA, Environment Impact Assessment. And then you take a call whether the benefits that we'll get from the project, is it worth taking this environmental risk? If it is, then even though there's an environmental risk, let's go ahead with it. Supposing those who are living in Bombay, and you will see that in Mumbai, and there is a huge problem for traveling, say from the suburbs to the town area, and they want to build an expressway via the sea. Just those who have traveled by the Bandra-Worli Sea Link. It's a highway, it's a flyover built over the sea. Now, how do you think the flyover gets built over the sea? It comes at a certain, forget the price, the economic price. It comes at an environmental price, because so much of local flora and fauna of the sea gets destroyed in order to build those flyovers. So it's not that there is no cost that we have to, and see, as human beings, we have to be we are not the only species. We are one out of billions of species that exist on this planet, and only when those billions of species exist in co-harmony will our planet survive. If only one species tries to be predominant and overwhelm everyone else, the planet will end. So you see, so there are always conflicting and competing rights. So you can't say in a public interest litigation that, one, or in any litigation for that matter, and this is the beauty of it, that one side is black, fully black, the other side is fully white. No, there are shades of gray on either sides. And this is where the court has to apply certain judicial principles, certain judicial norms. It has to apply evolved standards and techniques, apply its mind, its wisdom. That's why judicial work or judgeship work is so critical, so important, because decisions that you take will ultimately impact the environment, the economy, and it will impact thousands and lakhs of people. So the moral of the story is, the immediate short answer to your queries is balancing the competing rights. So that is what PIL is all about. Rupal?
Yes, sir. So getting back to Himani's question, she wanted to ask that when an elected member defects or resigns to the benefit of the opposition party, have any court ever tried to look in from the perspective that they are breaching the trust of the voters?
Yes. See, okay. Now I've got the question. It's a good question. See, this is, unfortunately, they have not applied this yardstick. Sadly, what you're saying is defection would mean breach of voters' trust. They have not applied this yardstick because they believe that an elected member, because see, India's parliament follows the traditions of British parliament, because just as we have a parliamentary system of democracy here, which came about in 1950, or 4750. So in UK, in the United Kingdom, this form of parliamentary democracy is going on for the last 500 years. So there are various practices and conventions and norms that were prevalent there that we have adopted in our constitution and in our parliament. Now, in traditional British parliamentary democracy, the member of parliament has the right. There would be no Anti-Defection Act in the UK Parliament. So the member has a right to vote as per his conscience. So that's a very important thing. So he is not bound by his party. Normally, of course, there are times when he is, but the laws in United Kingdom and also in India, they recognize the right of a parliamentarian or a legislature to vote as per his conscience. So therefore, this is the trick part. Now, how do you know that that vote is genuinely out of his compulsions of his conscience, or is it because of some extraneous considerations? You see? So at the end of the day, he has voted. He's defied the party and he has voted. He has defied the party on whose ticket he has been elected and he has voted differently. But then how do you know whether that vote is because of his conscience does not permit him to follow his party's line, or was it because he was bribed to do so? So this is an unfortunate part whereby there is a certain amount of trust that the constitution or the system vests in a certain person, like say judges or parliamentarians or ministers. They operate what is known under the public trust doctrine. So beyond a point, it's not everything can't be done in black and white or in hard and fast rule, because you have to place certain trust on that individual. If you don't, for example, now the government of India buys sophisticated weapons, fighter planes and ammunition from countries abroad. So the public trust doctrine operates that you would trust the government that they would buy the best piece at the best price and there would be no corruption. But if there is, what can be done about it? As in, beyond a point, it's just not possible for the courts to go to the root of the problem. Because beyond a point, the judges don't have that expertise. They simply don't have the expertise to decide which fighter plane or which ammunition is better, what was the price paid, and so on and so forth. So again, coming back to the original point of mine, that see, our members of parliament, our ministers, the elected representatives, they have to have a great sense of public trust doctrine in them, that they're sitting on this chair discharging a public duty. They're not here to make money. They're not here to make crores for themselves. And that can happen only if we elect the right persons. So if the problem in our country is, it's very easy. It is everywhere in social media, print, electronic, we blame our netas. I say there's no point blaming our netas, because we are the ones who elected those netas. So we have to blame ourselves. Once we rectify our own selves, only then will the netas automatically get rectified. So unfortunately, the courts have not been able to, get this course correction done vis-a-vis the MPs or the MLAs. Rupal?
So we have next question. How the contravention of the whip works? See,
what is a whip? A whip is, as in the literal meaning of whip would be that hunter. That is a whip. So, but in parliamentary democracy, there's no one goes in an assembly hall with a hunter or a whip, and wax the MLAs with that. So it's used to in a metaphorical sense rather than a literal sense. Whip is a one-line direction issued by a political party to its MLAs or its MPs, as the case may be. That is a whip. And if you violate the whip, and you have to give an explanation to your party as to why you violated the whip. And if the party is not satisfied with your explanation, then under para 2(1)(b) of the 10th schedule, you can be disqualified as an MLA. So whip is a very important process to enforce party discipline. For example, Hamari Sarkar hai, our government is there, and we find that opposition is filing a no confidence motion against us. So you need each and every of your MLA to come and vote in favor of against the no confidence motion and in favor of the government, in favor of your own party, your own government. So therefore you issue a whip. That's very critical, because if the MLAs don't come and vote, your government falls. Isn't it? It's something very critical, something very crucial. So therefore a whip is issued. And whip is issued on critical things, on important things. And violation of a whip has grave consequences. So one of the consequences is that the MLA can lose his seat and be disqualified in terms of 2(1)(b) of the 10th schedule. Rupal?
So diverting a little from the topic, we have Vinita asking, so what do you suggest law students aspiring to enter the field of litigation to be prepared for in their initial years of practice in a high court?
You have to be prepared for a great deal of hard work. You will have to work extremely hard, and you have to be ready to be underpaid. So be ready to be overworked and underpaid. So that is something that you have to be very clear. See, those of you all who are in the 5th year or will be going to your 5th year and soon will be getting placed, and you'll have to decide whether it's corporate or litigation. I would suggest it's a purely gratuitous advice, not binding on everybody or anybody for that matter. Go what your heart lies in. If you're corporate is an easier option because in the first initial years you will get paid a lot better than litigation. The work environment is sanitized. It's easy. You don't have to run from one court to another court, hungry, thirsty, sweaty. Yeah? So nothing of that sort. So it's up to your own choice whether you like corporate work or you like litigation work. And if you like litigation work, it should not be mere liking. You should have a passion for it, because litigation is physically very taxing and demanding. Apart from being intellectually also stimulating, it's physical and demanding. It's also mentally, yes, it's demanding, but also physically demanding. Corporate work may be mentally demanding, but not as much physically, because you're not under physical stress. Here in litigation, you'll be under physical stress. Secondly, you'll be under financial stress also, because the nature of the job in litigation is for the first 5 years, you don't get paid well. 5 years, 7 years. When I say not get paid well, I talk in comparison to your colleagues who might be joining a corporate law practice. The kind of placements that they get in a corporate firm, say one of the big fours pick you up, or one of the top corporates pick you all up, or you become in-house counsels, or you join mainstream law firms as corporate lawyers. So the starting salary structure or the payment that you would get, or the compensation as they like to call it, would be much higher compared to what you would otherwise demand in litigation. And that's why it requires great deal of passion to be overworked and underpaid. So it's not like you're overworked and getting more for that. You are working hard and you're getting lesser compared to your colleagues in the corporate sector. So you can do it only if you have a passion for it. And if you have a passion for it, and once you succeed, then 5 years, 7 years down the line, you will realize why litigation is so addictive and why litigation is, is something hard to let go of. Rupal?
So we have a follow-up question. If an elected member didn't follow the whip and take a stand other than that of a party in a parliament or assembly, so won't they be protected under the parliamentary privileges?
They would be protected under parliamentary privileges only if there is no whip. Once the whip is issued, they are bound by the whip. Then they can't plead parliamentary privileges. Then they have to follow the whip. And if they don't follow the whip, then they have to follow the consequences. The consequences are either they submit an explanation which is satisfactory to the party that has issued the whip and they are exonerated, they are forgiven. Or if the party which has issued the whip which they have violated doesn't accept their explanation, they can be disqualified under para 2(1)(b) of the 10th schedule. Rupal? Yes, Rupal. Yeah. Any further questions?
Yes, sir. So we're again diverting from the topic. So we have Suraj who's asking, so what are your opinions on the contempt charges on Mr. Prashant Bhushan by the Supreme Court? Do you feel the judiciary's intention of not having the public doubt its credibility, overstepping the rights of people to freely express their thoughts and pass a comment on judiciary?
See, I gave you the earlier example of a 10,000 crore plant being built vis-a-vis the rights of the forest dwellers and the rights and the imperatives of the forest itself, ecosystem. The same thing is here. See, again, there is no glib answer, no short answer, no black and white answer. It's the judges also are justified in their own sense to do what they are doing. And Mr. Prashant Bhushan also is justified in his own sense. Mr. Prashant Bhushan is exercising his rights as a conscientious citizen of India. His stand is that it is my right as a citizen of India and a duty as a citizen of India to bring out certain things in the public domain. And these things have to be discussed, debated and improved upon so that our institution of Supreme Court becomes better. On the other hand, the judges feel that making such an allegation is tantamount to contempt. And if you don't have any material to back these charges, so for example, he made this tweet about 4 of the past CJIs being corrupt, or 8 out of the last 16 CJIs being corrupt. So they are saying that you present material and prove it. If you can't prove it, then we'll haul you up for contempt. You just can't make an allegation, howsoever well-intentioned it might be, howsoever bona fide it might be, but you have to back it up. And if you can't back it up, then you have to face the music. So this is one case, just like in any other legal conundrum, where you can't say that Mr. Prashant Bhushan is 100% right and the judges are 100% wrong. You see? So this is again where you have to balance it out. Now, assuming Mr. Prashant Bhushan had said something which is contumacious or which is tantamounting to contempt, my personal view, and again, of course, it's my personal view. I don't claim to be an oracle or some Mr. Know-all, that my personal view is something that is the right view, that is the only view, and no other view is permissible. It is a purely subjective view. I may be wrong. I am the first person to acknowledge it. My personal view is that Supreme Court should have just let him off with a warning without getting into this elaborate hearing of contempt and convicting him and so on and so forth, especially in these times. So I can understand normal times we have courts functioning at full speed. And but there are so many matters of grave urgency where the court is not able to do it. And I'm not blaming the courts, because it's very difficult in this lockdown period to hear those cases. So so court time, even in normal times, non-corona times, non-COVID times, the court time is very precious. There are far too number of matters and far limited time with the court. And in these times, that the value of that time has only been enhanced. So it's all the more difficult and all the more precious to get your cases listed before the court in this time. And look at the number of man hours that they've spent on this issue. So firstly, I felt that they should have admonished him and let him go. They should not have got into this elaborate thing of convicting him and sentence. And secondly, even if they had to do it, they could have done it when the court was functioning at its regular speed, say 2, 3, 4 months down the line, when we would be mercifully or hopefully over this corona thing, and the courts would start to function in its normal course. Then that time you take it up. You have all the time in the world. Now there is great deal of pain and heartburn among various people that there are so many important cases. People are lying in jails. Their bail petitions are not being heard. Their properties are being demolished. People are unemployed. Migrants' laborers are there. You have problems of the riots, CAA, NRC, all these thriving issues which are causing great deal of turmoil across the country. You have left all those cases and you latched on to this. And you have spent considerable amount of time. So firstly, avoidable. And secondly, even if they had to convict him, they could have done it on a better time, and at a time when when the court hours are not so extremely precious and limited, because Supreme Court isn't functioning at full strength. No High Court in this country is functioning at full strength. There are limited number of judges sitting every day, and there are even limited number of cases being listed every day. So in all this situation, then to divert your energies, your time and effort into Mr. Prashant Bhushan, that is where I don't think it was probably very right on part of the Supreme Court.
So we have a follow-up question. What about the complaint not being mentioned in the contempt case, as first court said complaint and then suo motu? So this is the question.
I'm sorry, I think you'll have to be a bit more elaborate on that. I didn't understand the question. What about the complaint?
Sir, I'll repeat the question again. What about the complaint not being mentioned in this contempt case, as first the court said complaint and then suo
So
moto.
probably what you mean is that there was a complaint filed by one Mr. Mahek Maheshwari against Mr. Prashant Bhushan. And if that complaint has to be entertained by the Supreme Court, then under Contempt of Court Act, it has to have the prior authorization or the permission or the consent from the Attorney General of India. So in this case, the contempt case that was filed by Mr. Mahek Maheshwari, it did not have the sanction of the Attorney General. So if there is no sanction of the Attorney General, you can't file a contempt case in the Supreme Court. So how did Supreme Court get around that? Saying that we have not listed this complaint as the main case. We have received this complaint. We issue notice or take cognizance on it on a suo moto basis. You see, for example, a letter or a postcard that comes to the Supreme Court then takes suo moto cognizance of that. So similarly, in this case, what Supreme Court has said is these contempt proceedings are not initiated based on Mr. Mahek Maheshwari's complaint against Mr. Prashant Bhushan to the Supreme Court. Because if they had to initiate it based on that complaint, they could not have done so, because under law, a complaint can be filed only when the Attorney General in the Supreme Court, that is, and the Advocate General if it's in the High Court, only when they endorse it, only when they accept it. Yes, we give our consent to it, which is not given in this case. So therefore, it could not have been converted into a contempt case. So what the Supreme Court has answered to get over it is that we know that we have received this complaint from Mr. Maheshwari. We also know that it is not accompanied by the Attorney General's consent. So therefore, we know that we cannot proceed, or we cannot put this case as a contempt case and proceed against Mr. Bhushan. But what we are entitled to do, and they are right in that, what we are entitled to do is we can take the contents of this petition to us as a suo moto exercise of our past. So there they are totally right. They are within their past to do that. Yeah, Rupal?
Yes, sir. So now I would like to invite the faculty in charge, Center for Human Rights, Mr. Ahmed Afaq, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Ahmed sir, are you online?
I'm sure he has said quite a few good things about me, although I've not managed to hear any of it.
I'm extremely sorry.
Yeah.
So prior to going ahead with the vote of thanks, usually we have the cases of the moot courts and the mock trials where our students are continuously participating. So they have the moot problems, and they keep on, say for example, the majority of the moot problems are dealing with the public interest litigation these days. So to a great extent, what you have explained to them will be helpful in questioning the maintainability, because that is the very first issue they usually deal with. So if you could just help them as to how to approach a case. Say for example, we are having a moot problem or a mock trial. What is the the intricacies to approach a case?
The one tip that I can really give is that you start approaching a case from the opposite points of view. For example, if you are there from the petitioner side, one way to prepare the case is assume that you are from the respondent side, and what are the loopholes or what are the drawbacks that you can first point out. And once you have pointed out those drawbacks or loopholes, then try to work on the answers for that. Because see, our system, the case system that we proceed is adversarial in nature. So it's always A versus B, C versus D, petitioner versus respondent, plaintiff versus defendant. So it's adversarial. And whosoever has a better case, not necessarily the best case, not necessarily the true case, but whosoever has a better case wins. So therefore, one way to approach your problem is think what your adversary is going to point out against you. Think that first. And once you're able to cull out at, okay, if instead of the petitioner, if I was getting the brief for the respondent, and as a respondent, what are the arguments of mine that I can bring out with? So once you cull that out, then you come back to and sit on your chair as the petitioner, and then prepare the answers. So that way it will serve two purposes. Not only will you be able to prepare your case, you will prepare an effective counter to the attack that will be placed on you from the other side. Because see, this is not an elocution competition. So you just don't have to place your case and get over with it. You have to not only place your case, you have to also defend yourself from the attack of the other side. It's called adversarial litigation. So the tip that I'm giving you, what will help you to do both the things at one go, will enable you to prepare an effective counter to your adversaries. At the same time, enable you to prepare your case in a more comprehensive manner. So it's not like you prepare your best case, you just blurt it out and go. No, you not only have to prepare your case, you have to also answer the other side's case. And many a times victory or defeat depends on that. Depends as to how well have you been able to counter the other side's points rather than highlight your own good points. Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. It has indeed been a very enlightening and enriching experience for all of us. The kind of question posed and the follow-up questions, they reflect that how grossly the students were involved in the discussion, and I am extremely thankful to you. I would like to extend my gratitude on behalf of Center for Human Rights, Symbiosis Law School, Hyderabad, that you have accepted our invitation to be a part of our very first discussion for this academic session, and deliberated and discussed certain issues which are very having certain technicalities involved in them. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank my director, Professor Sarfaraz Ahmed Khan, for continuously helping us with and encouraging us to have more and more discussions of this nature. And I'm hopeful that this relation with you, or this connection with you, will continue even in the coming years and days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish all of you all the best of luck in your future endeavors. Please stay safe. We are still not over the corona crisis, and I hope you utilize this time to develop your skills. May all of you all find great deal of success in your chosen lines. You have all my best wishes, and I hope you all make your institution proud. And a big thanks to Professor Sarfaraz Khan, to Emmer, to Rupal for giving me this opportunity to interact with you all. I loved and enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you. Thank you, and God bless.
And for the participants, the case laws which will be received by us will be shared through email to each and every one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.